Welcome back. Today is the day where I'm talking about my favorite album of all time. 2 weeks ago I revealed my top 10 favorite albums of all time, as the culmination point of my top 100 favorite albums of all time video series that stretched out, months. I started that like half a year ago. 2 weeks ago it was my numbers 10 to 1, and after my number 3 and 2, which were Revolver and Rubber Soul by the Beatles, I was already so exhausted because it was such a hot day that spontaneously I told you my number 1, which is the White Album, but I also said I'm going to do an extra video where I talk just about the White Album because I wanted to finish the video last week. Or 2 weeks ago. So this is the promised video, me talking about the White Album. I haven't really prepared anything as usual with those videos, but before I started recording this, I just thought, what am I going to say about the White Album, because it's that's the appeal of that album, that it's so vast and touches on so many stories and things, and it's so eclectic, and whole books could fill thoughts about the White Album, which is one of the key reasons why I'm such a fan of that album, that it's so expansive. But to do such a video without notes isn't probably the best idea. But it's Football World Cup time, so I'm so distracted. I can't focus on my day-to-day life, plus the Football World Cup, plus making a video that's doing justice to my affection for this album. But I'll try it, since I promised that video. I just should have made it in the last video, just talk 2 minutes about the White Album and then finish it and wrap it up. But here it is, my video about the White Album. This is my favorite copy of the album. In the last video where I revealed my top 10, I showed you all different kinds of variants of the album I have, and said that I couldn't find my favorite version, but well, now I found it. This is the default version that I'm listening to now since I'm 8 years old. I'm now 43. I'm not good at maths, at counting. I don't know how long that is, but it's more than 30 years, right? Must be like 35 years that I'm listening to this album. It was, I think, the first studio album that I really consciously, completely listened to by the Beatles after I became a Beatle fan. It was in the household, possibly since I was born. And I do have very early childhood memories when I wasn't even yet a Beatle fan. I didn't know what the Beatles are, that I have, like when I was 4 or 5 years old, memories of listening to the song Good Night, which must have come from this version of the album when my mother played that song, and probably also I Will. I think my mother made for herself, when she was doing the ironing or something, like a music cassette tape of favorite songs, and I think she recorded I Will and Good Night, for whatever reason, those 2 songs from the album to that cassette. So I was aware of those songs in a way. And my first album I listened to when I became a Beatles fan was a Beatles Best Of, not the red or blue album, but like a small early 80s. It was called the 20 Golden Greatest Hits of the Beatles or something. It had no White Album song on it. And that was when I fell in love with the Beatles, and then I asked my father or mother, is there any Beatles studio album in the household? I was like 7 or 8 years old then, and this was, I'm pretty sure, the first I listened to. So it's often a thing with first impressions, plus white is like my color in a way, so there's lots of cosmic accidents that like destined me to really love this album the most. This is a German version from the late 70s. Like I showed in the previous video about my top 10 favorite albums, I have now like 10 to 15 different versions of that album on CDs and vinyl. I have mono versions, stereo versions, first pressings, all the like deluxe sets of previous years and then remasters and so on. but this is still my go-to version for whatever reason. You know, most Beatle purists and snobs would probably say stereo, in this case stereo, unlike the other Beatle albums that were issued on mono and stereo. A stereo first pressing 1968 is probably the purist's choice. But since this was like I said, a childhood thing and a nostalgia thing, I will always go back to this version. This is really my version of that album. What can I tell you about that album? You know, I really like everything about that album. Also, how they looked at that time. I like the poster. You know, this is also, that was the time, you know, I discovered this in 1991 or 1992. That was, CDs were already starting to be there, but it was still the last breaths of the vinyl era, and it was really the time when you could take your time to look at the cover artwork, and with this poster, the lyrics on one side, that those childhood or private photos on the other side. That was really something, you know, it would take like 90 minutes to listen to that album, and you could really meditate for 90 minutes on this thing alone. And still, it's this clean sheet, this whiteness also. So it's minimalist and maximalist at the same time. It's perfect for me. My favorite songs, you know, I once ranked all Beatles songs, you know, all 200 whatever Beatles songs, and according to this. But that's the thing with albums, you know, I'm more an album fan than a singles fan, I would say, in general. And this is the album. You know, in that video where I ranked all the Beatles songs, While My Guitar Gently Weeps came out as my number 4 favorite Beatles song, so that's my favorite song from the White Album. Dear Prudence was like 11. But that's the thing, that an album works differently, you know, it's not like a best of album where, oh, this is a song I like, this is a song I like. You know, when I'm really listening to the White Album from the first to the last track, I also really enjoy Wild Honey Pie and things like that. I think I just listened to the album a couple of days ago to prepare for this video. And it still, you know, it still strikes me that sometimes I think when I'm going into the album, okay, everybody says Wild Honey Pie isn't good, or Revolution 9, some people don't like Revolution 9, and I'm always like, are they right? But then I'm listening to the album, and again, I love every bit of it. I think it's a magical album, and I think it's, you know, my favorite movie. I also once ranked my favorite movies. Apocalypse Now was my favorite movie, and I think this is the Apocalypse Now of albums in a way. You know, the production hell of both things really, you know, they informed the art itself, so it's kind of fourth wall breaking, all the tumultuous things that happened on the one hand at the Apocalypse Now set, but also during the recording sessions for this album, they really went into the music, and you know like a tough time for everybody. Some people would say that this could lead to making it worse, but I think, you know, this tension in both cases, often it wouldn't work, but with Apocalypse Now and White Album, since they from the get-go were such mad ideas, mad concepts, it works, it really makes it better. You know, it would be if they were really like still everything was running smoothly and they did a 31 track album, maybe it would be a bit more like boring, like going through the motions, but that during that process of that album they really found out who they were as individuals, as 4 individuals, and we can see on the one hand there are still the songs where they really work to get together brilliantly as a band, and it's really great Beatle band songs, but then you also have those Paul finds himself and his identity, Ringo, George, John, and that adds something to it. That makes it, often the question is, what does a great double album need to justify it being a double album? I think that's what it needs in this case especially. That, you know, people who say it should have been a single album, like George Martin or somebody would say it should have been like a 14-track album. Yeah, if it would just be like the great Beatle performance songs, so that you have an album in the style of Abbey Road, yeah, then it would be a very good album. but you would miss out on the more eccentric songs, you know, when like a Revolution 9, or Wild Honey Pie, or even a Honey Pie, which, you know, many people don't like. I really love Honey Pie. And that's what makes it, in my opinion, better than Sgt. Pepper or Abbey Road, which were all those let's work together band efforts. And this is also that, but during times of strife and tension, and times where, you know, I don't want to play on this track, or he's busy with that track, I'm doing this track alone. You know, you have them collaborating, but you also have them growing as individuals, and really it's you know, there's this Sam Mendes movies are coming out, which show the Beatles story from 4 different perspectives, and this album is like this is the album for that movie in a way. This is, every one of the 4 Beatles had his own kind of struggle, of fight to go through. You know, Paul McCartney, for example, that was very tumultuous times in his life, which, you know, he doesn't really fully acknowledge these days, where he paints this great romance story with Linda. You know, that was a great romance, of course, but this was like a bit of a messy time. You know, he broke up with Jane. You know, many of the love songs on this album are still kind of about or influenced by his his relationship with Jane, but then he broke up with her, and then Linda was already around, but he wasn't yet committed to her as his main girlfriend, so to speak. He lived a bit like James Bond, like Sean Connery, James Bond, around the same time in the movies. He was a playboy, and he also had this more or less serious affair with this American girl, Francie Schwartz. And he took maybe too much cocaine at the time. That's something that's not often spoken about in Beatle books or the Beatles themselves. But cocaine was also kind of an important drug for the Beatles. It's not really a cool drug. It's not a drug or at least for the Beatles, it's not really the drug that you identify with the Beatles story. So they kept it a bit quiet. But around that time, especially Paul, you know, had almost a problem with his cocaine use or abuse, and that was also the reason why he was often very, you know, even more tense and even more egotistical maybe than usual, which also led to the thing during the Obla-Di Obla-Da sessions where George Martin walked out, you know, which is also a reason why I love this album so much. I really love George Martin, you know. If there's a 5th Beatle, probably he's the 5th Beatle, so I don't take anything away from George Martin, but the result of him leaving in the middle of the sessions, and, you know, the Beatles themselves, you know, the lunatics taking over the asylum, and the like 18-year-old Chris Thomas, you know, who wasn't even really a real sound engineer yet, but like someone who's, you know, getting trained or something, a trainee, and then Chris Thomas taking over, also led to a Beatle album that couldn't have been in any other circumstances. You know, for once the perfectionism of George Martin, and also Geoff Emerick, who also left in the middle of the sessions, also because Paul McCartney was such an asshole apparently, led to, you know, new production styles and sound aesthetics creeping in. You know, with the Chris Thomas sessions, you get those more raw songs, maybe that were also influential in the development of the whole Get Back idea. You know, it was more like the Get Back approach from half a year later with Glyn Johns. So you get more of the rocking tracks from Side 3 from Chris Thomas. But then George Martin returned at the end of the sessions and wrote some brilliant, typically perfect George Martin string arrangements and brass arrangements for songs like Glass Onion, Good Night, and so on. And, you know, in a different video half a year ago, when I think I was talking about the Pretenders, who were also produced by Chris Thomas, I told you that Chris Thomas is my all-time favorite record producer. You know, if I look at the list of my favorite albums and how many non-Beatle albums Chris Thomas has produced that I think are iconic albums, he's my number one. You know, he produced most of my favorite Roxy Music albums, the Pretenders, never mind the Bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols. So imagine you, as an 18-year-old, you're kind of the co-producer of the White Album, my favorite album of all time, and then 9 years later, you you produce one of the most iconic, revolutionary rock and roll or punk albums of all time. Then also in the 90s, he did it again with different Glass by Pulp and so on. And some of my favorite McCartney solo stuff, Back to the Egg, first and foremost. Chris Thomas did it. But still, there's also great Geoff Emerick magic on that album, George Martin magic, tracks they produced themselves, and also, what was his name, Phil McDonald or something. All those great sound engineers developed more of an identity throughout the recording process of this album, because everyone, sometimes they worked in 3 studios simultaneously on 3 different tracks, so they needed all kinds of engineers and producers. So this album produced lots of people who were just trainees or sound engineers, to develop their musical production language and become great producers in the 70s in their own right. So that's also great about the White Album. Like I said, Dear Prudence is my second favorite song, and I also like the fact, again, Paul McCartney being an asshole, when that argument happened back in the USSR and Ringo left, which led to the Octopus's Garden. Paul McCartney stepped in and drummed on a couple of songs, including the first 2 back in the USSR and Dear Prudence. And Dear Prudence is probably my favorite drum part on a Beatle record of all time. I prefer To Rain or A Day in the Life, Tomorrow Never Knows. That's my favorite drumming on a Beatle record. Because it's so expressionist and artistic, it's almost part of the songwriting. White Album is also an album where it's not about, like in the Revolver days, let's write a perfectly written song on a sheet of paper. It's more this improvisational and ad-libbing, and in the studio magic would happen, and things would, like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that wasn't like planned months ahead that Eric Clapton would play on that song. It was just, they were driving in the car and George just said, hey, I'm going to a Beatles session, would you like to join me, Eric? And then he came, he learned the song on the spot and improvised over it. So that's the magical thing about that album that happens on so many tracks on that album. Or Yoko and Patty singing background vocals on a couple of tracks. Also that hilarious thing that Patty said, Wild Honey Pie is her favorite song, please please include it on the album. It wasn't meant to be on the album, but it was like those coincidences. Someone saying, hey, that's my favorite track, and it goes on the album. And everything is so connected, so brilliantly. It's sequenced perfectly. And so many great songs on that album. And then there's the story about that. I always wanted to talk about this, but there was never the right video for this. This is like a rambling video without any concept, as you can see. But I mentioned this also. The song Sexy Sadie. I think I have an insider information about that song that almost no one in the Beatle community or in the music community has, because in all the interviews about that song, it's talked about that the song was called Maharishi initially. That's because John Lennon was a bit of a lazy guy and was always forgetting stuff. And he was asked in an interview, what is this song about? And obviously with those lyrics, it's about the Maharishi, it's about a guru that enriches himself and isn't the holy man he portrays himself as. So that's a great track about this thing. And in interviews, Lennon or Harrison said, initially it was called Maharishi. Maharishi, what have you done? You made a fool of everyone. And then George said to John, hey, I'm still a devotee, please don't make a song about it, that obviously call it something else. And then George suggested to John to call it Sexy Sadie. I'm also very interested in, I'm also kind of a devotee of Vedic traditions. I'm into the Hare Krishna movement. I'm not initiated, but I'm really I'm a believer of that, and I chant my Hare Krishna mantras every day and so on. I'm trying to follow the rules. So that's my kind of weird belief that I'm into, and George was also into Hare Krishna, of course. And so I'm also, a lot of videos that I privately watch on YouTube are Hare Krishna related videos by Hare Krishnas about the Hare Krishna movement. So that's maybe most of the videos I'm watching either on Hare Krishna stuff or on history, and music is only like the third thing, or philosophy is number 3. And it's music videos like this, content like this is probably my number 4 of my most watched videos. So I watch a lot of content by Hare Krishna people, and there was once this interview by a younger Hare Krishna who has a YouTube channel with an older one who back in the 60s when the Hare Krishna movement was in its infancy and the guru of the movement, Srila Prabhupada, had already made contact with the Beatles. The young Hare Krishna interviewed someone who was around then, who was a hippie Hare Krishna in the late 60s already, and he knew George Harrison. That old Hare Krishna knew George Harrison, and there are also photographs to prove it, and George has even talked about it and so on. So it's not like he made this up. And he said in this interview that a part of me, only people who are only interested in Hare Krishna stuff watched. He said that George told him the song was initially called Sexy Sadhu, not Maharishi. Sexy Sadhu, what have you done? And then George made the suggestion, please change at least the Sadhu to something else that still rhymes with the song, so that it's not that obvious about who it is. And that makes much more sense than changing it from Maharishi to Sexy Sadie. What does Sexy Sadie even mean? But when you think about it, Sexy Sadhu is the much better term to describe what John wants to get out about the Maharishi, like he's interested in sex and so on. Sadhu, if you don't know, is the word for like a holy man in the Indian Vedic traditions. So it's taking the piss of the Maharishi, and it's even a much more biting song title than the Maharishi, which would have been too obvious. But John, as usual, forgot this when he talked about it in interviews, and the true story would have even been better. It's even a cooler title if you want to make a diss track about a sadhu. Then Sexy Sadhu would have been a much better title. So in no Beatle book I read this, that it was initially called Sexy Sadhu. It's always Maharishi. But just listen to the song with the lyrics Sexy Sadhu, what have you done? It's much better. Yeah, but all in all, it's not really easy to make a concise video for me about this album, because ultimately this album is about not being concise. That's also something that I'm quite impressed with, and that I have like a natural affiliation with, things that aren't concise. That are concise with that whiteness, the minimalist thing on the one hand, but I also like, this more sprawling kind of feel, and that's really an album. You can listen to it and just have a good time, or you can get really into it and all the conspiracy theories, Charles Manson and so on. There's so much stuff in this album, and it's the Beatles maybe at the most interesting point of their career, and their career was one interesting point after the other, but that was really 68. That's really such an interesting year in Beatles story, with the India thing, the Yoko Ono thing, the drug thing, the Brian Epstein is dead, what are we going to do now thing, Apple, that's the first Beatles album, that was the first Beatles album, not the first album, but the first Beatles album released on Apple Records. The start of their own indie label that would, ultimately lead to the demise of the Beatles. But this is really an album that has like hundreds or thousands of stories, and I could only scratch the surface here. And now I have to get back to the Football World Cup. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.